Пане Романе, будь ласка, розпочинайте наступну сесію.
Дякую, пане Олександре. Так, насправді, представляти пані Оксану Забужко – це не з легких завдань, але будемо пробувати. I'll be speaking in English to introduce Oksana Zabuzhko to those of us who may not be as familiar with her person and work as everyone in Ukraine is. Oksana Zabuzhko is a leading Ukrainian writer. She debuted in poetry. Later, she moved on to the genre of the short story. She's also a novelist and an essayist, and she moves freely between all these genres to this day. Oksana Zabuzhko belongs to that generation which in the history of Ukrainian literature has gotten the term the generation of the 60s. We knew of the generation of the 80s, sorry. We knew of the generation of the 60s, and the generation of the 80s were the children of those of the 60s, and they redefined the direction of Ukrainian literature by the 1980s. I should also say that Oksana Zabuzhko holds an appointment at the Institute of Philosophy at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, from which she holds a PhD in philosophy. Her major works, I'll name just a few. I'll start with Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, a novel that caused a great stir in both Ukrainian society and literary circles and outside of Ukraine after that. This is a work that has been written about often, about its feminist aspects, about its view of Ukrainian history. It's a very complex book that touches upon very, very many aspects of what it meant to be Ukrainian in the 1990s with the coming of independence. I should mention the collection Sister Sister of short stories. Also a remarkable book, and later Notre Dame d'Ukraine, which is about Lesya Ukrainka, the author that has brought all of us together at this conference. And another book that belongs to Oksana Zabuzhko's oeuvre is The Museum of Abandoned Secrets. In this book, Oksana Zabuzhko demonstrated that she doesn't shy away from controversial topics. In this instance, using approaches close to those that look at history from new perspectives, and in this particular case, re-examining what happened in Ukraine in World War II. There has been a lot said about what happened in this part of the world during the Second World War, and this is Oksana's contribution to this narrative. It is a saga. It's not only about World War II, it's about later generations, and I should mention that in this book, Oksana Zabuzhko tackles head-on the story of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which has gotten a lot of press, not only in Ukraine, but in other places in the world. And again, this is Oksana Zabuzhko's understanding of what happened at that time in that place in Western Ukraine when Ukraine was overrun by the Bolsheviks. I should also mention that Oksana Zabuzhko is a very public writer and intellectual. She often comments on matters concerning all kinds of things, the current state of affairs, politics, international relations, cultural affairs, among many other issues. And she does this on very many forums, on radio, on television, and on social media. Some works written by Oksana Zabuzhko have been translated into many languages, most notably, again, Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, but that is not the only book. More books have been translated into other languages, and a poetry collection, Keynote in English, this was in the early 2000s, I believe, that it came out. Please, Oksana, correct me if I'm wrong. The Canadian book I have in mind. Your microphone is off.
Last year, collected poems, selected poems appeared.
And selected
2020
poem, yes.
From,
Sorry
yes,
for
from
yeah,
Aerosmith in Boston.
For omitting that. I should also mention that Oksana Zabuzhko's work has often become subject matter for film and theater productions, and that continues to be the case. And finally, I should say that Oksana Zabuzhko continues to travel a lot throughout the world, something that she began in the 1990s with stays in the United States, in various places, teaching and conducting research there. And today, I think that Oksana Zabuzhko is often regarded as Ukraine's prime international spokesman. Sorry for the word spokesman, spokesperson. This is, after all, a conference that is sensitive to language like this. So it is now my great pleasure to hand over the microphone, virtually speaking, to Oksana Zabuzhko, and for all of us to hear her thoughts about Lesya Ukrainka. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romane. Many thanks to Professor Veretelnyk. It is always a little bit awkward to listen when someone is introducing you and speaks about you and what you've been doing in life. But, well, okay, I probably have to start here as well. For the title of my presentation is the death, as you probably can see in the program, the death of Don Juan, modernism, feminism, nationalism. And it is very closely connected with my book Notre-Dame d'Ukraine, Ukrainka, conflicting mythology, Ukrainka in the clash of mythologies, the subtitle, which has already been mentioned several times here before, for which I am extremely grateful. And for those of you who are not familiar with this work, because it was not translated into other languages, it is only available in Ukrainian. In this 600-something pages long study, I made an attempt to restore one of the most important and until recently most blatantly ignored Ukrainian modern literary tradition, for which Lesya Ukrainka is a best guide, has been chosen by me as a guide and proved to be the best guide. The tradition in which it thoroughly scrutinized could serve as a sample case to illustrate one of the key problems of our entire civilization: the defeat of what once used to be known as high culture in the world run by almost unbridled populism in whatever form the latter may perform. For the purpose of the current presentation, I have chosen to expand one of the side plots of my book, which has an advantage to be internationally known and therefore would not require from the audience any special background in Ukrainian studies. At the beginning, though, I have to clarify my use of terms, of which the juxtaposition of feminism and nationalism sounds probably the most controversial, at least for the Western ear. Needless to say, historically, there have been too many feminisms as well as too many nationalisms for me to risk at redefining and reconceptualizing them here towards the 21st century view of a feminist theory of nations, especially taking into consideration that such a view is in itself eclectic enough to blur the picture of the worst. My target, though, is far more limited, to have a look at the development, or more precisely, at the extinction through the past 20th century of but one literary plot, namely the Don Juan legend, in an attempt to see through its turns and twists something else than the understandable cultural changes in sensuality and sexuality. One may duly argue that since Tirso de Molina's classic, The Trickster of Seville and the Stone Guest, written between 1612-1630, the Don Juan archetype has persevered through centuries as probably the central myth of European culture, the epitome of manliness, according to the formula by Ortega y Gasset. In his at the beginning of the 20th century, actually in its first decade, George Bernard Shaw, in his preface to his play A Man and Superman, wrote on this subject something very astute, which I'm very much tempted to quote. Now it's all very well for you at the beginning of the 20th century to ask me for a Don Juan play, writes George Bernard Shaw, addressing his editor. But you will see from the foregoing survey that Don Juan is a full century out of date for you and me. And if there are millions of less literate people who are still in the 18th century, have they not Molière and Mozart? You would laugh at me if at this time of days I dealt in duels and ghosts and womanly women. End of quotation. Shaw's concern was, of course, predominantly about cultural changes, and his play indeed has nothing of the Don Juan legend in its section. Yet, for instance, some half a century before Shaw's scornful remark, European literature has witnessed The Diary of the Seducer by Søren Kierkegaard, which, although skipped ghosts, duels, and womanly women as well, nevertheless did succeed in presenting quite an accurate psychological case study of the Don Juan of the mid-19th century. To give him to give a hint at the hero's true lineage, Kierkegaard even named him Johannes, which is the Danish version for Juan Giovanni. So it is not thus the plot itself. Forget about duels, ghosts, and other things. But the myth, whose historical lot in the 20th century will be in question. And in following Don Juan's adventures in the literature of modernism, I will try to see through them the entrance upon the stage of history of the new dramatic persona. New players whose meaning only nowadays becomes fully visible. With this regard, of course, literature provides an inexhaustible source of discoveries, though generally regarded as a part of intellectual history. In fact, literature is only too often far ahead in time of purely intellectual trends like philosophy or political theory in shaping ideas, so that the close inspecting look can more than once reveal in the literary works of the past the burdening ideas which did not receive a full-fledged theoretical articulation, not to speak of public recognition, until generations after. And the story of Ukrainka's Don Juan presents a perfect example of such a belated or postponed reading. But before I come to this, I have to be moderated, since I always have problems with timing. Before I come to this, I have to dwell a little bit on my use of some concepts like nationalism, especially in its relation to feminism. It is truly hard nowadays, after all the apocalypses witnessed by Europe in the past century, to strip nationalism of its derogatory connotations and to restore its original meaning of a doctrine of popular freedom and sovereignty as it appeared in the 19th century. Originally, we must not forget the European idea of nationalism before it turned into a political principle that holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent, used to occupy a firm place within liberalism and humanitarian. That European nationalism, according to some historians' witty formula, begins as Sleeping Beauty and ends as Frankenstein's monster, came largely as a result of the nation-building process being replaced, or more than once halted, by the state-building process, which is certainly not the same thing. Whenever a state overshadows a nation and the hyphenation mark between the two appears, it is precisely the point at which the 19th century dream of a free nation risks to turn into a nightmare of ethnic cleansing and deportations. Among many definitions of nationalism, I'd like to stress the one proposed by Adrian Hastings, who, in answering the question about the relation between nation and state, wrote, I quote, "Even when it is the state which has created the nation, it is not a nation until it senses its primacy over and against the state." It is a very important point, and I fully share the opinion of those thinkers who see the pitfalls of nationalism in the Nazi Germany, or in Serbia under Milosevic, or for that matter in Putin's Russia, or even present-day Poland, as manifestations not of the advanced, but on the contrary of the underdeveloped and retarded nation formation process. Maybe we can talk about this later in the discussion if we have time. I'm making a special point, a special account on this point for a reason most immediately connected with the feminist cause. In the Western academic consensus, nationalism and feminism in Europe are generally regarded as incompatible and mutually exclusive positions. Nationalism is tacitly identified by most Western European feminists with the, maybe not exactly Nazi-like, but still the supremacy of the white or ethnically pure males in the patriarchal state, which by definition, of course, excludes any room for the very idea of women's liberation. Such a theory, though, deliberately reduces the variety of European nationalisms to the one and only pattern taken into consideration, to the state patriarchal ideology. It deliberately ignores, as allegedly irrelevant for European history, which is not the case, only too many cases of positive relationship between feminism and nationalism in Eastern and Central Europe. The cases of nationalism without state, in which this part of Europe has been particularly abundant throughout modern history. In such implicit erasing the difference between state and nation, between nationalism as a doctrine of self-determination and nationalism as state political practice, the proponents of the incompatibility theory seem to be marked, even if unwillingly, with the old Hegelian and Hegelian Marxist prejudice which had associated the European lot with the so-called historical nations only. The Cold War inertia of separating proper allies, Western Europe, from the one on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the one made of nations considering themselves the losers of history, as Milan Kundera once put it, endangered in their very national being, owes, I assume, a lot of its sustainability to its long-term fusion with that Hegelian tradition or Marxist tradition of thinking. Noteworthy, even the most ardent proponents of this incompatibility theory, like Australian feminist historian Gisela Kaplan, have to admit then that in what they define as European tradition, one can also find examples of mutually fruitful relationship between feminism and nationalism. Kaplan numbers two such cases: the 19th century Italy, under and after the Risorgimento, and the 20th century Finland, interwar period. Yet characteristically, she claims them both to be but chance encounters, exceptional instances. She does not go as far as to trace any semblance between the two, neither to place them into a broader context of European nation building. Such a one-dimensional vision of what belongs to the European tradition and what does not apparently demands for correction, especially now in the post-Brexit world, when discovering a universal common denominator for the European identity becomes all the more problematic and challenging for all the intellectuals. Apart from Italy and Finland, feminism has constituted an inseparable part of the landscape of national revival almost everywhere in Europe, as long as the construction of nationhood has not been viewed in patriarchal terms. Unifying a nation in its struggle for liberation is in itself a gendered project, which created, in many cases for the first time in history, a significant public place for women. Please note this moment, it draws the parallel with the early decades of Christianity, which has been Lesia Ukrainka's major concern throughout her entire literary career. Again, if we have time, I might come to this back a little bit later. It never fails to amaze me, by the way, how efficiently the obliteration mechanism works when it comes to women's part in history, even where it concerns recent events of which all the participants and witnesses are still alive. For example, you will never come across, I really hate to skip this part because it's really juicy and it helps to bring more light upon the misreadings and misunderstandings of Ukrainka's dramas as well. Like you never come across any mention in the contemporary Ukrainian textbooks that the first public organization in the then yet Soviet Ukraine, the organization which had in fact started our Velvet Revolution for independence and our first Maidan back in 1990, was the organization of women, the Soldiers' Mothers Union, Spilka Soldatskих Матерей. Its leadership consisted of women whose sons were killed in the ranks of the Soviet army during Soviet colonial war in Afghanistan, and the activities of these resourceful ladies were very much visible of the time. They have challenged, I would say, the Soviet patriarchy in its most touchy spot. Their major political goal was that the Ukrainian conscripts were not sent for the service outside of Ukraine, which of course immediately attacked by the power of the time as a blatant nationalist demand. But soldiers' mothers gained a vast public support, and in 1990 their demand was included on the list of the Ukrainian Students' Union under their famous hunger strike, the first Maidan, the revolution on granite. So this was the actual beginning of the Ukrainian independence and quite possibly of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now 30 years after this episode is at best a footnote to the deeds of other public organizations of the time, which of course were led by men. So the typical example of how innovative initiatives on the part of women absorbed by power systems soon become credited to the system's account. And it should be also added that in the age of information, the speed of forgetting the past seems to increase dramatically, and women's contribution usually falls the first prey to this charge. And I think this example is quite spectacular to prove how careful historians should be when making judgments on the role and place of women in any political landscape of the past, nationalist included. Unlike in Germany, where a nation was a fatherland, in many countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe and in Slavic languages, it has been motherland and embodied femaleness, which called for protection against violation by foreign males. Rape was often used as a key metaphor for colonial national humiliation. And from within such a discourse, it would have been hardly conceivable either for Italian or Finnish or Polish or for Ukrainian woman public figure to share the famous argument by Virginia Woolf, who said, as we all remember, that as a woman she had no country. The feminist discourse in these countries was turned the other way around. Rather than challenging nationalism, it was introducing a new dimension to it, revealing a double discrimination, a twofold burden to which women were subdued, both as women and as members of their subjugated national group. It had been largely the same rhetoric as later on articulated in the writings by American Jewish feminists of the 70s, like Adrienne Rich and Erica Jong, on how Jewish women were twice marginalized, twice discriminated against, both as a woman and as a Jew. But we must not forget that there have been precedents for this rhetoric in the European history, and Finland is certainly not an exceptional occurrence with this regard. All the above speculations were meant to clarify a little bit the ideological context in which I'm going to discuss the evolution of the Don Juan story in the 20th century. Let me remind you that the mutinous 19th century, which had so inadvertently determined the course of the following 20th century, had also been, and hardly by mere coincidence, so the age of Don Juan's utmost glorification. No longer a trickster or debauchee, nor even a mere libertine like in Molière. Since Molière's Don Giovanni, this epitome of manliness, quote, had been reshaped subsequently by Hoffmann, Byron, Mérimée, Zorilla, and others into a rebel son who defies authority, be it earthly or heavenly, and whose lineage thus includes Prometheus, Cain, Saturn, Hamlet, and Faust, among many others. As George Bernard Shaw epitomized it in the same piece that I have quoted at the beginning. What attracts and impresses us in Don Juan, I quote, is the heroism of daring to be the enemy of God. Don Juan became such a pet that the world could not bear his domination. End of quotation. A true fin de siècle Europe had witnessed the upsurge in popularity of the philosophy of Don Juanism. In Ukrainian cultural tradition, the perfect example of this tradition was presented by Volodymyr Veretelnyk, quite a figure to scrutinize in this regard. So it is all the more remarkable that in the very years preceding the outburst of World War I, the Don Juan legend, for the first time in 300 years, met with the interpretation on the other side. The stand was taken up by women. Two women authors, both coming from the margins of the European continent, simultaneously, though independently, not knowing of each other's work, produced their own versions of this Central European myth of irresistible manliness. I have also to note that the very first attempt at undermining the Don Juan myth from a gender perspective was made by Georges Sand in her novel Lelia, one of Ukrainka's favorites, by the way. Though it was not a full version of the legend, neither did it represent a confrontation of equally matched opponents. The chapter on Don Juan is more of a frustrated lamentation of an abused female victim, but still the note should be made. Yet, in this decade before World War I, so two female versions of Don Juan. In Sweden, in 1909, appeared the play Don Juan Tenorio by Anna Eckerheim. In Ukraine, then part of the Russian Empire, 1912, appeared drama in verse, The Stone Master by Veretelnyk. This was the major contravention of tradition, well guarded by the over 2,300 male versions of the theme. Over 2,300 male versions of the Don Juan legend, by then written by male authors. Well, alas, neither Swedish nor Ukrainian play succeeded to wreak havoc in the European literary scenery of the pre-war time, though for very different reasons. Anna Eckerheim was considered to be a minor writer, and her contribution was ignored, allegedly for artistic reasons. It is hard to tell whether this was really the case, since her Don Juan Tenorio was never translated into any other language, and in Sweden she is by now almost completely forgotten. I've been checking many times. The case of Lesia Ukrainka is, however, far more complicated and far more interesting. Though by no means a minor writer, on the contrary, a celebrated national classic, nowadays the only woman pictured on Ukrainian money, which for our foreign listeners should be noted, present the whole pantheon of national heroes since the medieval Kyiv princess. So she nevertheless belonged to the minor literature, the very existence of which was then endangered, and the usage of which language, be it in press, school, academia, publishing, was strictly forbidden, were it not for the western part of Ukraine, then belonging to Austria-Hungary by the 20th century. Ukrainian culture would most likely have found itself on the verge of extinction after half of a century of being completely banned in Russia. So, I mean, this has been within Ukrainka's lifetime, and all the more amazing her accomplishment against this backdrop. And quite understandably, that from within the endangered literature, her message and her challenging the Don Juan legend could not be heard outside of the country. Until now, Lesia Ukrainka remains, we have to admit this, very little and poorly known in the West. She shares the lot of the entire classical Ukrainian literature. The entry on her in English Wikipedia, accompanied with the same portrait of artist as a young girl, which we can see on the Ukrainian banknote. I mean, while she died at the age of 42 as a celebrated classic, authoring 14 volumes of superb literary work, now finally appeared as the first full collected work, full complete work, I'm sorry. But this entry, well, I mean, please check at your spare moment, and I'm sure you will. You can get a good wholehearted laugh. I mean, no. Of 20 dramas which she wrote, only 4 are mentioned there, and only one is featured. For some reason, it's her first one, the Blue Rose. And the Stone Master, which is her recognized masterpiece, is not even mentioned. The message thus remains unheard until now. Now on the message itself. In its general setting and plot, the Stone Master dutifully follows the tradition. Don Juan pursues the lady, Donna Anna, kills the commander, her husband who defends her honor. Later, Don Juan issues an insulting invitation to the stone statue of the commander, and the play ends when the commander returns to life to destroy Don Juan. Everything fits. The story itself remains untouched, but that is where the similarity with the previous versions ends, without resorting to any disrupting changes. Lesia Ukrainka produced not a version of the legend, but rather a subversion of it, and most importantly, of its archetypal contents, by giving a floor for the first time to full-fledged women characters. It was since 18th century treatments of Don Juan, in fact since Don Giovanni visits Elvira, that women characters began to take more place, thus reflecting the changing position of women in European society and literature. However, in all the versions authored by men, women characters were developing in the accordance with the archetypal angel or monster dichotomy, which remained central to the myth. Contrary to the tradition, the Stone Master depicts what can be described at first glance as the classical battle of sexes. The battle ultimately lost on both sides, though for entirely different reasons. What proves to be on stake behind the habitual settings of dual ghosts and womanly women, to quote Zabuzhko, is not love, nor even sexual pleasure, but power. Lesia Ukrainka herself has been describing this play to her friends as political drama. The critics are probably right in stating that it is not Don Juan who makes the central character in the Stone Master, but Donna Anna. It is her story, and essentially her tragedy. Such a reversion of the traditional gender roles is considered by academic consensus to be a birthmark of literary modernism, and it was particularly characteristic for Lesia Ukrainka. In her dramas, as you all know, she succeeded in rewriting a significant part of Greek and Christian mythology from a woman's point of view, having transformed each story into a female myth. So it's notably, and it should be stressed over again and again, her story of the Trojan War was told as the tragedy of Cassandra. Her story of Christ was told in two dramas about his women disciples, one, the possessed, about Mary, or Miriam as she is named in the play in accordance with the Gnostic tradition. Another, Joanna, wife of Chuza, about the character mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verse 3. Both dramas introduce an extremely powerful feminist dimension to the Christian myth. All the more remarkable that in this Lesia Ukrainka was at least half a century ahead of her time. She was very much ahead of her time in many other regards, but this should be stressed specifically, as it was not until the last quarter of the 20th century and the development of feminist theology that the participants of women in early Christianity received a thorough and serious scholarly revision. So what Ukrainka accomplished can and should be comprehended to a considerable extent as retaking European cultural history from men, repossessing it by women. And the Don Juan myth couldn't but present to her the most momentous challenge with this regard. It is true, thus, as I said before, that Stone Master is first and foremost Anna's story. Don Juan himself admits that she is his equal, and that is precisely what makes her so appealing to him. That's why I strove so hard to win you, as he says. Yet, in fact, he is clearly her inferior. I even dare say her instrument. From their very first meeting, at which she immediately takes control of their relationship, to the tragic finale when she seduces him with the prospect of becoming a successor to the honors and power of the late commander. She encourages him to try the commander's overcoat, and having done so, Don Juan symbolically becomes the commander's replacement. At this moment, the ghost of the commander emerges from Juan's reflection in the mirror, and placing his hand on Juan's shoulder petrifies him. Such an ultimate merging of the two principal male characters underscores what little difference really exists between them. At the beginning, they seem to be the opposites. Don Juan performs as a mutinous knight of freedom, defying all social constraints, restrictions, and conventions. He's banished from Spain for his innumerable duels and amorous escapades, but takes a risk to return, full of contempt for any danger. On the whole, he is portrayed as an embodiment of an archetypal woman's dream of a liberator, which Simone de Beauvoir, in her Second Sex, found common both among young girls who believe a liberator will take them away from their family, and for married women who believe he will take them from under a marital yoke. Donna Anna is not alien to that dream either. To her friend Dolores, another major female character of the play, never existing before in any literary tradition, Don Juan's loyal fiancée committed to him in a kind of a religious self-sacrifice. Anna reveals in the opening scene her recurring dream, which becomes the key metaphor of the play. In her dream, Anna envisages herself as a princess locked in an impregnable fortress high atop an unscalable stone mountain. Although many knights might try, none has yet been able to fight his way into a fortress. This very much Freudian dream of a liberator clearly reflects Anna's, as probably any woman's, inner conflict between her secret hope to find love without having to surrender her freedom on the one hand, and her need in a hideaway, in the inaccessible retreat where she at the same time could be a top that is in control of the forces which protect her, dealing with her emotions from a position of strength, on the other hand. The commander Don Gonzago, to whom Anna is first engaged, then married, is to her a stone mountain. Due to him, she rises to the highly honorable social position. Gonzaga's ambition, we must not forget, goes as far as conniving the plot in order to gain this role. But the price she has to pay proves to be evenly high, and Anna finds herself virtually locked in the cage of societal code and petrifying courtly restrictions. It is in the moment of moral exhaustion that she surrenders to Don Juan, or rather permits him to seduce herself and to play a liberator to his, however brief, satisfaction. For that is exactly how Ukrainka's Don Juan sees himself, as a donor, liberator, a redeemer of women who gives them what they want and enables them to reach their potential, a pattern of male behavior also noted by Simone de Beauvoir. Again, half a century later, 40 years later, sorry. To Donna Anna, he claims that it is his duty to save her proud free soul. All the more disappointed and disconcerted is he to discover that killing the commander has not yet completed liberation. Anna is not going at all to subjugate herself to her liberator. On the contrary, she strives by all means to keep her social position. In the eyes of society, she dutifully plays an honorable and respectable mourning widow and finds nothing but laughable Don Juan's proposal to flee with him into exile. True, there is no point in doing this, since Anna has disguised the commander's death as a result of robbery, and Don Juan is not a suspect. The problem is that, apart from escaping now and again with the woman at his will, in order to force the world to reject him, as Don Juan proudly declares, only he is free from world whom world rejects, and that I forced it to do. Кого громада, той тільки вільний, кого громада геть жене від себе, а я її погнав сам принц. So Don Juan has, apart from this, Don Juan has no other behavioral pattern in his mind. Anna's well-elaborated plan to invite the liberator, the alleged liberator, into her fortress as her new husband, rather than to subjugate herself to his will, appears to be the first in the history of the legend truly serious test for Don Juan's proverbial revolting individualism. And this test Don Juan fails to stand. First, he is defeated by Dolores, his ever-forgiving fiancée, the born victim whose only goal in life seems to be to sacrifice herself to save his soul. The triangle Anna, Juan, Dolores is even more interesting than Juan, Anna, Gonzago, if only because women's competition is far more subtle and nuanced as compared to men's duels. And women's fight is over man's soul rather than over his body. In her ultimate expression of self-sacrifice, Dolores prostitutes herself to obtain from the king Don Juan's pardon, which Don Juan gladly accepts and congratulates himself, rather self-conceitedly, яку я гарну вигартував душу. What a beautiful soul I have forged, reasoning that through him, Dolores has reached a high, reverent pinnacle. By the way, this is the motive often to be found in Ukrainka's work, and not only in hers. A man subdued to a social oppression makes a woman to pay for his humiliation. I call it a syndrome of Abraham in Egypt, referring to the story in the Old Testament. You remember when in the Egyptian slavery, Abraham became Sarah's pimp, giving her to Pharaoh as a concubine and pretending to be her brother. In modern times, this motive is particularly characteristic for the feminist national discourse and And in Ukrainka's dramas and epic poems, it is one of the recurrent motifs. Juan's conceit with Dolores, however, cannot be taken otherwise as a big delusion on his part, as in reality the things are just the opposite. It is Dolores who, by surrendering her chastity for rather than to Juan, enters into possession of him, becomes the spiritual Juan, so to speak. She ingests his spiritual identity and in the final output, his manliness, like the archetypal mater edax, the devouring mother. As a rehabilitated nobleman and no longer a social outcast, Don Juan takes his place as no more than a cog in the same ominous social machinery once personified by the commander. That he is then so easily tempted by Anna's proposal to take the commander's position. This is again the typical modernist reversion of the gender roles, for it is clearly Anna who seduces Don Juan, not the other way around. That he yields to the temptation and agrees to partake in the system which he has professed to rebel against, completes his downfall and proves that his heroic individualism has really been a fake, meant to disguise his weakness rather than his long glorified strengths. Both women thus, each in her own way, defeat Don Juan by unmasking him. The reason why both lose their battle is not because Don Juan is a winner, but because the confrontation is not evenly matched. Whether opposing the commander or merging with him, Don Juan makes part of an unshakable stone system of patriarchy, whereas each of two women stands alone. That is what makes Ukrainka's Juan so subversive of his archetype. The play is not about a strong individual whose Promethean revolt allows him to rise above the norm to a height from which he can challenge God and capture the imagination of those around him, as the Don Juan myth maintains. The play is about the stone master, not an individual, but an elaborate system of the patriarchy, which might consist of insignificant men, yet is designed to endow this insignificant man with invincible power. Let me remind you that the play was written in 1912, that is, 32 years after a woman in literature was born as a hero. Okay, I have to, I see that I'm following the time and I still need 5 minutes somehow to make sense out of this, even though I need actually a quarter of an hour to finish what I've prepared. But it is important to know that in 1880, Henrik Ibsen, one of Ukrainka's favorites, delegated to a woman for the first time in European cultural history the burden of the tragic action. This clearly designated, probably in more convincing, surely more visible way than hundreds of them existing women's organizations, the arrival of women upon the stage of history. Lesya Ukrainka was a second-generation feminist. Her mother, Olena Pchilka, was herself a public figure of very impressive caliber and leadership, a spiritual leader, a writer, one of the luminaries of Ukrainian nationalism, well, who actually can be described as a mother of Ukrainian nationalism, one generation before Mikhnovsky, a co-founder of the Ukrainian Women's League, and along with Natalia Kobrynska, also the first speaker for the women's cause in the literary almanac Pershий Вінок, the first wreath which appeared in 1887, supported by Kobrynska and Pchilka. So she may be duly regarded as the first Ukrainian feminist speaker. Yes. And Ukrainka's highly sophisticated feminist attack on the central myth of the European patriarchy, achieved by giving a language to the gender experience previously left mute, had in a way, I would say, confirmed George Bernard Shaw's argument that in the 20th century, Don Juan is inevitably and irretrievably dead. To play a hero, he needs a society that keeps its women behind barred windows. To execute his power over women, he needs women to be disempowered, left with nothing but dreams. In a way, it is women themselves who had created him through their own dreams. Why wonder then that it is women, or rather one woman, the one that gathered us all together today, who put an end to women's own creature as soon as he was no longer needed. That is, as soon as women started to gain control, however limited, over their lives. Yet there arises probably the most serious question of the unwritten drama of contemporary history. Namely, if it is not Juan but Anna who puts on the commander's overcoat, will the stone master be in any trouble? Up to now, the assumption of power by women hasn't yet introduced any radical changes in the nature of this power. Once promoted to the decision-making positions, women quickly become petrified into the pillars of the established order. The identification by women with the initially denied status quo, with the very power structure which were previously, when inaccessible, considered oppressive, was first noticed in the Western intellectual tradition by Julia Kristeva back in the early 80s. I have to, oops, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, oops, sorry. It's another proof. So Kristeva, in fact, you know, Kristeva's study on Don Juan in Tales of Love. I'm skipping this part because, as I see, I've already taken more than 50 minutes, and no one is going to stop me. Well, which is very kind, which is extremely kind of you, but I'm bothered. I'm worrying about about the open mic and about the possibility of the discussion. Just one point to be introduced. Please don't forget to read Kristeva's tale of love, because the The true core of Don Juanism was first revealed in Lesia Ukrainka's Stone Master only over 70 years later, on the new stage of feminist movement, was epitomized by Julia Kristeva in her Tales of Love. According to Kristeva, Don Juan was not exalted by sensuality, but by the evidence of his being able to place under his power by diverting them from their own path, seducere, all the women he meets, end of quotation. So Kristeva's deconstruction of the Don Juan myth nowadays reads as a brilliantly provocative theoretical comment to what Lesia Ukrainka had accomplished in the Stone Master 70 years before, no matter whether Kristeva herself was familiar with the play or not. What really matters, and what I find to be of particular importance, is the continuity in the exploration of the symbolic order which can be seen between two phases of European feminism. The one represented by the Ukrainian writer, the second one by the French philosopher. The challenge for all the students of Ukrainka is now to bring the two together, to make French philosophers and other Western intellectuals aware of their predecessors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana, for your talk, for delving so deeply into the history and context of the Don Juan legend, and for describing Lesia Ukrainka's relationship to it, her version-subversion of the legend, and what that meant later and means for us today. I think we have time for several questions. So please, if you do have a question, please let us know here on the Zoom page or in Facebook, and we'll take your questions and ask Ms. Zabuzhko to perhaps share her thoughts about them. Who would like to ask a question? Perhaps then I have several. Well, no, I don't want to ask several questions, but just one, because of the time restrictions here. Oksana, if I could ask you this, you mentioned that Don Juan is now dead in the 20th century. Well, of course, he must be dead in the 21st century. If thinking of theater, either Ukrainian or outside of Ukraine, can Lesia Ukrainka's play, text, still say something, or is it a period piece? Is it something for academics to delve into and look at?
I'm sorry if I did not make myself clear. The story was about women conquering Don Juan and coming to the stage of history in their struggle for power. And now that we have entered the 21st century, which is going to be a women's century, and in which women and women's movement the role of women, a role played by women in history, occupied by women in history, is going to be more and more visible, crucial, important. I mean, it deserves another lecture, probably a course of lectures. So Ukrainka's play actually belongs not to the 20th, but to the 21st century. It's been warning for all of us, and yes, the the technologies used by women now joining the system and becoming the pillars of the system, coming atop of the mountain as decision makers. The influx of Annas into politics, business, and I mean, Anna actually could be, Anna was played on the political stage, has been still being played on the Ukrainian political stage by Yulia Tymoshenko. I would say, well, up to such details as white dress and men, you know, the knights raising hair atop of the crowd, you know, the crowd of men of her party raising hair, dressed in white atop. I mean, that's been the best performance of Don Juan alive so far. I don't know, intentionally or not intentionally, but the best performance of Ukrainka's Don Juan alive. And even though they did not breathe a word about Lesya Ukrainka, and all the more striking are these coincidences. And I'm really grateful for this question because I somehow miscalculated time, and I had to speak a little bit longer, you know, to make this probably more well, I don't know, understandable and this point. So thanks for helping me.
So when you speak about Death of Don Juan in the 21st century, you mean that we will never see new reinterpretations of this legend in the world literature?
Well, I would say, no, not really, but I mean, if you are asking me about the reinterpretations later on, coming back to the 20th century, I would not mention Čapek's story, which is really, which is very funny. The Death of Don Juan. He has a story under such title, written Karel Čapek, the Czech prose writer. In the 30s, in the story, he describes Don Juan on his deathbed, confessing to the monk at hand in all his sins, but not committing himself to this capital sin he is notorious with, that is to the seventh commandment, yeah, to the breaking of the seventh commandment. So the dialogue goes on and on. The monk reminds, and how about all these women, and how about the seventh commandment? No, and Don Juan denies everything, and finally some superior monk comes up and says, and manages to fish the truth from the dying Don Juan, that in fact he was an impotent all his life on. So he was seducing women and then running away, you know, before any physical, you know, penetration was possible. So it is kind of, I would say, a very male way, man's approach to kill Don Juan, with this scornful interpretation. I would say more interesting interpretation, more recent and more interesting, comes from Don Juan's in Milan Kundera's novels. All his characters, you know, are following the great seductor in their social and sexual behavior. But then again, you know, it's kind of, I would say it's rather a pathetic view, because apart from bad, they don't possess any power anymore. And we can, I mean, this can, you know, take, as you see, it gets different shapes, but the most interesting part, you know, about this most interesting approach, this male and female power, and how female power tends to be, I don't know, more inventive in terms of psychological manipulation than male is. I mean, here Lesya Ukrainka was the first to have warned us. And I never fail to reiterate that we still know about women less than we do about men. So we have to read what women, especially great women like Ukrainka, has managed to tell us, well, all the more attentively and with, I would say, the full awareness that it is not about the past, and it is not meant for academia. It is about the future.
Thank you, dear Oksana, for insightful speech. We would love to listen and to speak with you more, but we are forced to finish as our event will begin in 4 minutes. So thank you one more time. It was honor and pleasure to have you on our conference. Applause, bravo.
Thank you.
And we will be glad to see you on our next events. Thanks
for having me.
Thanks, Oksana, for setting such a high tone as our first keynote speaker. And we really appreciate you being with us and sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks a lot.